Rise up!
This is the Rise Up See Red podcast, all about the Arizona Cardinals and the NFL, featuring insider and outsider perspectives. Enjoy the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Now here are your hosts, Jess Root and Seth Cox.
Hello, Arizona Cardinals fans, and welcome to the latest edition of the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. I'm your host, Jess Root from CardsWire.com, the USA Today NFL Wire site that covers Arizona Cardinals. In the middle of our opponent preview series, as we've been doing the last several years in July, leading up to the season where we look ahead at the Cardinals' opponents and bring on an analyst writer. We try to get all the NFL Wire writers that cover our Cardinals' opponents to kind of look back over the last season, talk about the offseason, the upcoming year for that team. And in this edition of the show, we're going to focus on the Miami Dolphins. The Cardinals will travel to Miami in Week 8, just before the trade deadline. And with me for this edition of the show is Adam Stites, who runs newly running DolphinsWire.com. Adam, good to have you. We worked on the same network for a long time. I don't know if we ever had a conversation in the years that we were both at SB Nation.
I don't think the Jaguars and the Cardinals paths crossed all that often. So yeah, not so much.
Well, welcome to the show. First timer on the Rise Up See Red podcast. A few guys have been like regulars for like 3 or 4 years. But I'm glad to have you on. So we look at the Dolphins, who are a very exciting team. They look back at last year, 11-6, number 2 in overall offense, and kind of the thing that we always deal with the Dolphins is they play at an extremely high level. The question is whether Tua Tagovailoa will be able to stay healthy, and he did last year. But they've got that fatal flaw of cold weather games. It seems to have been a problem with the Dolphins since forever, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly got about as cold as it can get in their playoff game this year. It was quite the extreme, especially for a team coming from Miami. So yeah, I mean, it really bit them, among other things.
So tell me about how did the 2023 season look? Going into last year, what were sort of expectations, and how did the performance overall match up with the expectations?
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit on it. The question about Tua was and still is to some degree the health, whether or not he can make it through a season, and that was so much of the focus last year was, he was taking jiu-jitsu and doing different things to try and get himself through an entire season, and he did. And I think you saw what this offense can be if they have all the the pieces flying. But I think health was again the story here. Down the stretch, you lose Jalen Phillips and Bradley Chubb, the top 2 pass rushers, and they're just signing Melvin Ingram and just any 35-year-old pass rusher they could find off the street to get in there for the playoffs. So the defense kind of fell apart. Offensive line wasn't healthy for a lot of it. Teron Armstead missed a lot of games, which has been kind of an annual issue. So, the cold bit them. The health bit them again. But, the story going into last year was if they can get Tua healthy for an entire season, this offense will be scary. And
that's exactly
I don't
what
think
it
that's
was.
changed. I don't think
Mike
that's
McDaniel's
changed. Yeah.
run scheme is arguably as good as Kyle Shanahan. You had over 1,000 yards from Raheem Mostert. If you remember from the days with the 49ers, he was just a dude who came out of nowhere. Tyreek Hill with a fantastic historic type season, nearly 1,800 yards. Adding Jalen Waddle with over 1,000 yards. What couldn't the Dolphins do offensively, really?
Yeah, and the question was depth, I think, for them, and it kind of bit them a little bit, where they had Tyreek Hill, they had Jalen Waddle, and then after that, they couldn't find a guy that could get even 300 yards receiving. There was no third option. So when you missed either one of those guys for any stretch at all, the offense really kind of went to neutral. And yeah, so they add Odell Beckham Jr. this year. They hope that can be a reliable third option. They draft a couple receivers late. Jonnu Smith, I think, is a pretty underrated signing that they did this year. They haven't had an effective tight end since in the entire Mike McDaniel era there in Miami. So, I think that's the question, is whether or not they can branch out beyond just the top two receiving targets, because the backfield, they've got plenty of options in the running back room.
Well, and as McDaniel's run scheme goes, kind of like Kyle Shanahan's, it's kind of like put someone back there with certain traits and they're going to be successful. They're going to be successful.
Yeah.
Is kind of how that happened in San Francisco, seems like year after year. Defensively, the pass rush you got before Bradley Chubb got hurt, he had 11 sacks last season. Zach Sealer had 10 sacks. Christian Wilkins, 9 sacks. Andrew Van Ginkel, 6 sacks. He got 6.5 from Jalen Phillips before he got hurt. I mean, statistically, if you look at over the course of the season, they were 25th. They were 22nd in points allowed, but they were a top 10 unit in yards. Although what would you say about that defense overall if you take away the injuries late?
Yeah, I think it was a defense that got home more often than not, and they ended up parting ways with Vic Fangio after 1 year. But to his credit, it was a team that was racking up sacks, and the question is going to be whether or not they're able to do that with how many departures from that group that you just listed. Christian Wilkins has gone to the Raiders. Andrew Van Ginkel's gone to the Vikings. And then you have Bradley Chubb coming off of a season-ending ACL tear that happened on New Year's Eve, so very late in the year. And Jalen Phillips tore his Achilles in November. So that's the big question mark, is the return of those two guys and the patch-up job that they've done elsewhere, with Calais Campbell coming in for on a 1-year deal, and just kind of piecing together Shaq Barrett. We'll see where he's at, and that's probably the biggest question mark about this defense, is whether or not that group that racked up all those sacks can even come close to doing the same kind of production this year.
Coming up next on the Rise of Zero podcast, Mr. Cardinals Talk on the Web. Let's talk about the offseason. Continuing with Adam Stites of DolphinsWire.com. What did the Dolphins do this offseason? That's coming next on Rise of Zero.
So I think the big concern was going to be departures. I mean, they were kind of in a salary cap crunch. They had to let Robert Hunt go off the offensive line, Christian Wilkins go off the offensive line. So departures kind of stole the headlines. I thought they did a pretty strong job of filling holes as cheaply as possible. Odell Beckham Jr. is on a cap hit of less than $3 million. So is Calais Campbell. So is so many of their signings. They signed a bunch of defensive tackles, Neville Gallimore and Jonathan Harris, and and Tierra Cart. So they really filled up the depth chart with a lot of pretty cheap signings on like 1-year deals, and it's not ideal for the future, but I think they did an adequate job of filling enough holes that I don't think the roster takes a significant step back. But that really was the story of the offseason, is that they lost some very high-priced players and they patched it up.
Yeah, and it's going to be hard. Now, on the defensive side, who's leading the defense? Vic Fangio's gone. Who takes over as the DC now?
So they got Anthony Weaver, who was the defensive line coach up in Baltimore for a while. And he's sounds like a player's coach. They really seem to like him. He's less of the disciplinarian that Vic Fangio was. And I think ideally for the Dolphins, you see them kind of let the players be the players. Last year, Jalen Ramsey, I think in Fangio's defense was essentially just an outside corner. I think that we're going to see in Anthony Weaver's defense maybe more of that Jalen Ramsey kind of all over the place.
Like he did over the last couple of years when he was with the Rams.
Right, exactly. So I think we'll see if that pays dividends, but I think that's the kind of the coach that they're hoping they're going to get out of Anthony Weaver, is somebody who lets the talent dictate how the defense looks.
Now he was obviously with Baltimore, so under Mike Macdonald. Who are his defensive influences in terms of scheme?
He's a defensive line guy, so he's and he's he was with Houston prior to Baltimore. So I think you see that Kubiak kind of style defense, or not Kubiak. I'm sorry, but yeah, he's a defensive lineman first. I think you're going to see that kind of pressure and getting after the quarterback first and foremost.
Are they going to stay? Are they going to stay like base 3-4 this year?
Yeah, I think that. I would imagine there's a little bit more flexibility now, especially when you got kind of these guys that can put their hand up and down, like Shaq Barrett. Like they drafted Chop Robinson, Mohamed Kamara. I think you got a lot of guys that are a little bit scheme diverse, but I think base, I still think it looks like a 3-4.
Well, and like Fangio is a very Fangio and like Wade Phillips, their 3-4s were very, very traditional. In many senses. They're not exactly the same, but they're very traditional. Is that the way they come off the field is they always take the nose tackle off and go nickel that way. They have set roles. They don't generally move their cornerbacks around very much. They have set roles for them. Is kind of the idea for those. Like the Cardinals, who also run a 3-4 base, which was a surprise because all of the influence that they had were 4-3 stuff. And Nick Rallis here in Arizona, they do a lot of different. They have different. They will go big nickel. They'll do a basically a 5-man front. So rather than taking the nose tackle off the field, they'll go with one inside backer instead of maintain that 5-man front in nickel. They've also got the traditional, they take the nose tackle off. So they've got 2 or 3 different, they've got a regular nickel, they got a big nickel. And when the Cardinals had Vance Joseph here, their defenses were pretty traditional because he was a Wade Phillips guy. If we look at, so who of the guys that they added, obviously they added some experienced guys, Calais Campbell, Shaq Barrett, Odell Beckham. Of those guys, who do you think will have the most impact incoming this year?
I would look at the secondary. They also added some veterans there. Kendall Fuller and Jordan Poyer, I think, are pretty important additions, and we'll see how much of an impact they make. Jordan Poyer is up there in years. He's probably, this could be the last year, maybe even. But they've got a rising star at safety in Javon Holland, and they haven't really been able to find a guy to pair with him. It's been kind of a revolving door, and they brought in Deshaun Elliott last year on a 1-year deal, and he was fine, but he was nothing special. I think if you get Jordan Poyer back there and he gives you even close to the level that he was at in Baltimore, I mean, not in Baltimore, in Buffalo for much of his career, I think that really rounds out the secondary. And Kendall Fuller, I think, is another guy that Xavier Howard leaves. His play was dropping off pretty significantly. Kendall Fuller pops in there and gives you good football alongside Jalen Ramsey for an entire season. I think we see a much different secondary than the one that was really struggling to do much of anything late in the year last year.
You move on to the draft. Chop Robinson, their top pick, the super athletic pass rusher out of Penn State. What are your thoughts on him? Because I know going into the draft, there was a lot of question. It was like Cardinals were looking because they had the 27th pick as well. Chop Robinson was the guy that we kind of talked about and looked at. And you're like, athletic with little production. What do you see out of him? How much of an impact do you think? And we know pass rushers, first-round pass rushers as rookies, you can't expect like crazy numbers usually in that first season. What is kind of your hope for Chop Robinson?
I think he's going to have an opportunity to really make an impact early, especially if Bradley Chubb and or Jalen Phillips aren't ready to go. I think there's a chance for him to really step out there week one and try and make things happen. But I think ideally for the Dolphins, he's more of a curveball for a while, where he's just a rotational rusher who comes in and gives you some juice, and he has that burst off the line and can make things happen. But yeah, like you said, that there was a lack of production in college. There wasn't very many sacks. There were a lot of pressures. So there's something to be said about the fact that he was making things happen without finishing. But the Dolphins in recent years, Chris Greer, the general manager, his philosophy has pretty clearly been to draft players with this very long-term approach and not expect much early on. Their first draft pick last year, Cam Smith, was on the field for 20 snaps. And so they're very fine with players taking redshirt years, so to speak. And
that works when you're a playoff team, I suppose.
Right. Right. So, yeah, I mean, if you have a team full of veterans, after Chop Robinson, their second pick is Patrick Paul, an offensive tackle who probably won't see the field at all. Jalen Wright, a running back who's going to be behind Raheem Mostert and maybe eventually take over. So they're definitely seeing their draft picks as players who will eventually take spots, eventually be starters, but not anytime soon. So I think that's probably what they see out of Chop Robinson, is a guy that just rotates, gives them a few snaps here and there, but ideally they would like him to sit behind this group of veteran pass rushers that they have.
Muhammad Kamara was a guy that Mel Kiper actually gushed about in terms of the potential as a pass rusher. I know people were really, really excited about Malik Washington as a late-round receiver. You also had Patrick Morris out of California, Taj Washington out of USC. Of any of those late-round guys, is there anyone that you could see as a sleeper, as someone that contributes in year one at all?
I like Malik Washington a lot. I think that's the guy. There's not a lot of receiving depth on this team. You know, there's obviously the headliners, Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle, and now Odell Beckham. After that, they really struggled to find another receiver. And they didn't have Odell last year, but Braxton Berrios is more of a return guy. River Craycraft is probably a roster bubble kind of guy. They just could not find that fourth option or third option. So I think Malik Washington is a guy who makes a lot of things happen after the catch. So he's kind of can be perfect in that Mike McDaniel, get him the ball on a 4-yard throw and let him make something happen. And he's very sure-handed. He had a really productive year last year at Virginia, led the nation in receptions. So I think he's got enough polish to get in there early on and make things happen as a potential fourth option.
Coming up next on the Rise of Zero podcast, the best of Cardinals Talk on the Web, we continue the conversation looking ahead to 2024 for the Dolphins. That's coming next on Rise of Red. We're back on the Rise of Zero podcast, the best of Cardinals Talk on the Web. I'm still talking to Adam Stites from DolphinsWire.com. Looking ahead to the 2024 season, they won 11 games last season, went to the playoffs before exiting in that first postseason game. What are the expectations for the Dolphins this coming season? What would be reasonable to think that they should be able to do?
I think they have to be pretty sky high. I think if they don't win a division or don't make an impact in the playoffs, I think it's pretty much a disappointment at this point. They did have some subtractions this offseason, so I think a lot of people are looking at this as a team that's gone backwards, but they've also brought in a lot of veterans on one-year deals for a reason. This is a team that expects to make an impact, and the rest of the division looks kind of open for the taking. It's been ruled by Buffalo for a long time, but I would say Buffalo took a bigger step backwards this offseason in terms of subtractions than Miami did. So, yeah, I think the expectations are that this offense looks a lot like it did last year, and they're hoping that they've added enough depth now that they're insulated a little bit from the injuries that kind of ate them up late.
What do you think that Tua's ceiling is? Last season, 29 touchdowns, over 4,600 passing yards. What do you think his potential ceiling is as a passer?
I think that's probably right around where it is. I think that's the kind of numbers that an ideal situation is going to give you. I'm not sure that it would be fair to expect much more. Just physically, I don't think he's a guy that's going to take it to a whole nother level. If he's healthy and in a situation like this with receivers like that, I think those are the kind of numbers you can expect. If there's an area for an improvement, I think his mobility was a little lacking last year. He added some weight to try to avoid getting injured, and I think the mobility took a step backwards. He was more sackable, made less people miss, picked up fewer yards with his legs. And this year he's tried to lose that weight again. So is he putting himself in danger of being injured again? Well, I guess we'll see. The Dolphins seem pretty confident that he's doing it the right way, but I think the goal for him is to be a little bit more light on his feet and tougher to get to. But in terms of a passer, I think that we saw a ceiling.
Tyreek Hill, can we expect that sort of season from him again? Like, is it fair to think that he can get 1,700 to 2,000 receiving yards for a second straight year?
It seems like there's no signs of slowing. So, yeah, I think it'd be tough to say that we expect it, but I certainly wouldn't rule it out.
I guess what comes with that is that he doesn't have to get that high if, for example, Jalen Waddle adds a couple of hundreds. Like if Tyreek drops down to 1,500 and Waddle's over 1,200 and you get, 600 from someone else, I guess it's not that. But I guess last year it was the Tyreek and Waddle show in the passing game. But is that kind of your hope, is that you don't have to have like historic season consecutive years for the passing game to hum the way it did?
Yeah, I think they add Jonnu Smith to the mix. They add Odell Beckham Jr. to the mix, and maybe Malik Washington, Taj Washington. Somebody makes an impact. Maybe it doesn't have to be him getting 1,700 yards. But he's also Tyreek Hill. I think if you're not taking advantage of what he is, then you're probably not hitting this offense on all cylinders. So I would be surprised if his numbers drop off much if he's healthy. I think if you get a healthy season out of Tyreek Hill, it's hard to imagine them not kind of going until the wheels fall off on this one.
Looking for worst case, best case scenario, how do you view this team doing? What's reasonable? What do you think is a worst case scenario for them, and how high is their ceiling?
So I think, the ceiling is pretty high. I think if this offense is healthy, we've seen what it looks like, and it's dangerous. And then the question on defense is whether or not they can bring enough pressure to kind of recreate their best moments last year. But I think best case scenario is this team takes a small step forward, and that's enough. And that puts them in the mix for best team in the AFC. And gets them in the big moments in January. Whether or not they have what it takes to actually win those games, they haven't shown it yet. Even last year, through the regular season, they beat a lot of bad teams, and they didn't look good against the good ones. So I think best case scenario, we see a team that wins 13 games, and then we'll see. We'll see after that whether or not they can do it. Worst case.
Is this a team that you think could win a Super Bowl?
Maybe.
It's an interesting question, because you're like, yeah, they can win 13 games, and you're like, you're like, I think everything has to go perfectly in the postseason for them to win the Super Bowl, but they're definitely a playoff contender with kind of a fringe, kind of the, like, you wouldn't want to call them a favor, you wouldn't necessarily call them Super Bowl contenders, but you're definitely in the mix. They should make a deep run, and then when you see them do it, then you're like, okay, maybe it's just been following the Dolphins for too long and have those disappointments come.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think it's I'll believe it when I see it kind of situation. They've clearly got a lot to work with here, and it's hard to imagine them not having an opportunity in those kind of big games late. But a lot of things are going to have to go right. Yeah, it's a team that I think doesn't have much room for error. And offensive line depth is pretty lacking. So if there's any injuries there, I think it could kind of unravel. And I think that you talk about worst case scenario, that's the worst case scenario, is that the injuries hit anywhere and there's just not a replacement there. Offensive line, I think, took a step back. They lost Robert Hunt, who I think was probably their best offensive lineman at right guard, and they didn't really replace him. They're hoping Liam Eichenberg maybe was a former second-round pick who's been kind of just a reserve guy most of his career. Maybe he can step in and be that starter. But I think the two areas where they pretty clearly downgraded were the offensive line and the defensive line, interior offensive line and the defensive line. So can this team win in the trenches, I think, is the question, and that's going to be really loom large late. So that's the worst case scenario, is that any kind of injuries on those two fronts. What else do they have?
And with that, we will wrap up. Oh, but before we do that, actually, because I always like to ask this question, looking on the schedule as the Cardinals and Dolphins play in Week 8, how do fans view that Cardinals game? How challenging is it viewed? Obviously, the Cardinals coming off a 4-win season. They are expected to be better this year. Some think that they can, in a best-case scenario, be in the mix for the playoffs late in the year. But what is the kind of the consensus of how that Week 8 home game is against the Cardinals? An expected win, should win, or challenge at all?
I would say that probably most think of it as a should win, especially any kind of home game against a West Coast team. I think people kind of start licking their chops and just feeling like that's a tough travel assignment. And yeah, I think there's anytime you get a team that only won a few games the year prior, I think most people kind of see it that way. There's a lot of pitfalls that could come with that, especially the way the Dolphins struggled with mobile quarterbacks at times. So that could be a real issue there. And yeah, so I don't think it's certainly not a one that's in the win column already in a lot of people's minds. The Dolphins have been plenty capable of dropping weird games. Will Levis came into the Miami and embarrassed them on national TV. So yeah, I think, I don't know that there's very many Dolphins fans who look at any game as like a guarantee, but that feels like one that they'd be pretty disappointed to lose.
All right. And with that, thank you, Adam, for your time. That wraps up this edition of the Rise Up Sea Red podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web. That's Adam Stites. You can find his work over at the Dolphins Wire, dolphinswire.usatoday.com. We'll be back again very soon with more opponent previews. That's Adam Stites. I'm Jess Root. Thanks for listening, as always.
Thanks for listening to the latest edition of the Rise Up Sea Red podcast. Listen to previous episodes and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Audioboom, or many other podcast platforms so shows are delivered directly to your mobile device. Please give the show a 5-star rating and always support the sponsors who support the show. We'll be back soon for the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Rise up Red Sea, be Red Sea Red, and of course, Rise Up Sea Red.
Roll!